fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren. Mr. Joe, Minister Goldberg.
Minister, yeah, I have a new title. No More Smoker Joe, and I can be Minister Joseph Goldberg. Thank you very much. And there's a story behind that.
Yeah. Sounds
My
deep.
son's getting married in November, and he wants me to do his wedding. So through the Universal Life Church, which is the biggie, I got ordained in a non-denominational church, and I'm making sure I'm reading all the laws in Tennessee. Wow. It's quite I read the 2019 law, I read the federal case about whether ordained people can do weddings in Tennessee, and I'm going to do it. We'll find out later.
Wow.
They won the ULC won the case, or it got stayed, so I'm going in. I don't think everybody believes it, but I'm going in, and I'm going to try to make it through my son's wedding in November, so I got time to build up. So I'm a minister now, so thank you very much. Working on my Pope wave still.
So we can start calling you Father?
No, that's what I don't like about it. That's what I don't like. If it's
Daddy.
non-denominational,
Daddy.
it's non-denominational. Yeah, no. No, I looked up whether I'm Jewish by background. I'm Jewish. Does Judaism have a online ordained process? Not really. No. And some have, but I would like to have had more behind push a button and you're ordained. I'd like to have had a little bit more, just to say something, just to know. And it's not denominational. That's the whole point of it. It's, believe what you want to believe, just don't bother anybody else while you're doing it. That's kind of the theme. Yeah. So I got a card and I have a certificate. Ooh. Thank you.
Big Daddy Joe, is that what it's?
Yeah, so if anybody is nay. I get emails from saying, Minister Goldberg. I'm like, who the hell are you talking to?
Yeah.
Those two words that kind of don't go together normally.
Yeah. You'll be sitting with the Pope watching a football game or a baseball game.
When he comes to Chicago to visit the family, we'll drop on by. But
yeah, hang out. You can do some of his work.
He can teach me. Kind of like how Blair does.
Blair. Yeah, he's minister too. Minister of murder. No, minister of crime.
He's a bloody murderer.
yeah, he's partially in blood.
No, now Zodiac was never solved. So
he is
Zodiac.
Blair
those years.
He says he's young. He wasn't born.
That's right.
Please, they all. Mr. Blair Kroeber, right?
Right. Yes, Blair Kroeber. And Joe, I should point out, first of all, congratulations on the impending nuptials of your son. But I should point out that I myself am a minister in the Universal Life Church.
Yes!
I was
brother!
I was ordained in about 90 seconds. I would say I did this about 10 years ago.
The drive-through.
Yes.
That's what it is.
I was gonna perform the marriage of two very good friends of mine. I did end up performing it. And in advance, did my ordination, and I'm based in Los Angeles. And so this is in California, and California's laws are very lenient about the actual marriage ceremony and who performs it. So the Universal Life Church qualification cleared that hurdle very easily, and I performed that marriage, and then went on to perform another one. And I believe you can pay a little extra. You pay like $19.99, and you become like a doctor of divinity or a doctor of metaphysics or something like that. I've never quite taken that step.
No. I bought the kit. As you're sort of required to. We had that guy to the card and the thing, and they really is an interesting site. I mean, this is what the show's about, but it's also based in California. But like anything, you can write about it and you can do it. So
yep,
that's
They send you a collar too, like a collar.
Well, you can buy them. That's what I don't like. I'm sorry if they're listening. I'm sorry. Stay away from that. Just help people out. And if you're non-denominational, you're non-denominational.
Sure. Yeah, and I think it was sort of devised as kind of a workworkaround. I mean, are there really Universal Life Church people actually worshiping somewhere? I think it's just kind of a workaround for the law, right?
Yeah. Well, they do things, right? There's sort of a ministry kind of thing. They're in California, right? And they have a great website. They have all these resources, but they try to say they do things. Like they do, but you can tell whatever it might be. I don't feel bad doing it. You know what I mean? Like I'm trying to get around something. I'm probably more of a minister than I'm a thriller writer right now. So
It's interesting too that we still, like, as a country and as a culture, we still marry, so to speak,
Yes.
religion to the institution of marriage. I mean, in some ways, one should be irrelevant of the other. And I guess in some ways they are, because you could just go down to the courthouse and get legally married. But yeah, no, I don't think a marriage necessarily has to be buttressed by religion. I grew up ostensibly Catholic, but the Catholic church we attended was very, very unorthodox, very Bay Area where I grew up, very kind of crunchy. And there was a lot of talk of kind of the feminine face of God, and we didn't have any stained glass or any pews. And I remember one of the women who worked in the church heading liturgical services had her Universal Life Church qualifications. And that's the first time I heard about it as a kid. She had done it and then was going out and sort of doing semi-Catholic rituals and rites under the auspices of being a minister for that. It was just kind of fascinating how she was sort of skirting through all the Roman Catholic Church rules.
Hey, partial in blood. So what's going on? You decided to change kind of what your avenue is, so to speak. Like, you're not really. This is kind of a little bit different for you, right?
Yeah, I am originally a screenwriter. As I said, I'm based in Los Angeles. I work in the film and television space, and I sort of am predominantly a screenwriter. But I've published various pieces of short fiction over the years, and I tried my hand at a novel, and this is sort of the work as it has come to fruition. It's called Partial in Blood, and it's available right now exclusively as an audiobook. It's on Audible and Apple Books and Spotify, anywhere you might get your audio programs. But the reason for that was I'd written this novel, and I really love the audiobook form. I have several friends who are actors and are very accomplished in this and have kind of major followings. I probably shouldn't mention their names. They might have feelings about that. But I sort of was adjacent to the business. I am an avid devourer of audiobooks. And I was really intrigued by the idea of taking this crime thriller that I'd written and doing it in the audio format. And I know as a screenwriter that the best way to approach this stuff is you really want top-notch performers. They really elevate the material. And I kind of set out to get one of sort of the luminaries of the field, and there was only a couple of people on that list. But the first name on that list was a lady named Emily Wu Zeller, and she thankfully agreed to do it. And it was kind of an amazing partnership. She is a very well-regarded performer. She's absolutely brilliant. She does a lot of audiobooks. She also does a lot of voices for gaming. But I reached out to her and sort of showed her some writing samples. She read some chapters of Partial in Blood and I think immediately responded to it. But she's just incredible. I mean, she can bring these characters to life so vividly, and she can do a whole range of accents. The main character of the novel is a woman, and so I knew it needed to be a female protagonist. And she just really elevated the material to kind of the next level, which as a writer is what you always kind of hope for. But yeah, I'm a huge lover of crime fiction. I love a good mystery. I love a good thriller. And this was sort of sprang out of those milieus. Specifically, I have a background as an actor. I studied theater arts in college, and I was sort of a dramatic writing emphasis, but I did a lot of stage acting, and I've done various bits of screen acting over the years. And I just really love actors, and I love the craft of acting, and I read my Uta Hagen and my Stanislavski back in the day. And I was really intrigued specifically by the quality that many actors have of wanting to vanish into the character. You see this a lot with the sort of Meryl Streeps, the Daniel Day-Lewis types, who are kind of actors of disguise. They have that chameleon ability. And I think that's why a lot of professional actors often chafe against being a movie star or having to go out on press tours or whatnot, because they see the craft and the work is about vanishing and dissolving within the character, not putting your own personality front and center, which is what's usually required of being a movie star. But I love that quality of actors to kind of disappear into the craft. And I was really intrigued at the notion of an actor or an actress. The character in the novel is called Allegra Tarot. And Allegra is so talented that she has that chameleon ability. She can change the gait of her stride. She can change the set of her body. She can change the cadence of her voice and maybe put on an accent or discard it. And so she can wear a disguise that comes from her own abilities. It's not like she's putting on an eye patch and a peg leg, but she can sort of disguise herself either to disappear into a crowd if she doesn't want to be noticed, or if she wants you to remember this encounter, she can fix herself in your memory by presenting one way or another. And I was really intrigued by this character who started out as an actress, and in the novel, she's a former television and film actress who had a fair amount of success as a character actress, but then she suffers a personal tragedy, and because she has some familial affiliations with like a bail bondsman business and private investigations, she ends up going into that field. So she's a former television and film actress who now works as what's called a skip tracer, which is a kind of private investigator who seeks out missing people or hidden assets. And so she's this detective who uses her acting abilities in the course of her investigations.
Sort of sounds like Joe, a chameleon.
Yeah.
Go from a writer
Back
to
in the
a
80s he
minister
did.
to he does it all.
One day he's a minister, the next day
one
a
day
happy
he's
father.
smoking meat, he's
Well, back in the agencies, I was a nuclear physicist one day, and I was a television producer another day.
Cool.
You play chameleon.
yeah.
But,
I love it.
Now that I'm out of practice now, so now I just talk to you guys.
How
How far I've fallen.
I hope it's equally as exciting.
Yeah.
Well, it has its moments, Well, listen, so Allegra, how do you write a female character? And I mean that not in an aggressive and attack way. I just mean this sort of like, what do you do to set yourself into a person that is a female?
It's interesting. So I was raised by a single mother growing up, and my grandmother lived with us. And, when the babysitter wasn't available, or the old lady across the street wouldn't babysit myself or my brother, we would go to work with my mom, and she was a nurse. And I would hang out at the nurse's station. I pretty much grew up kind of kicking around her hospital. And once the nurses got sick of me hanging around the nurse's station, I'd go meet up with the housekeeping staff, the janitorial staff, and kind of walk around with them, chatting with them and helping them with their duties. I just kind of grew up around women. I'm married to a fascinating and kind of prismatic woman. And I just, I think in the current milieu that we're living in, I think gender has always been sort of a complex thing, but I think especially now we're realizing how multifaceted the concept of gender identity really is, and how it's sort of a spectrum. And I just always really identified very closely with women, had a lot of female friends, and I was particularly intrigued by, I think some of the struggles that women undergo in our culture are very different from what men experience. And I was intrigued by the notion of this detective who is moving through the byways of contemporary Los Angeles, donning these disguises, discarding these disguises. And I was intrigued by the way that gender might inform those experiences and those journeys. She was a mother who lost her child, and that's kind of a plot point in the story. And so in some ways, there's kind of an undercurrent of grief in the story. In the main action of the novel, she is hired by a bail agent to find a bail skip, this young woman who's jumped bail and gone on the lam. And the bail agent who hires her is actually her ex-husband. And so there's kind of a delicate love story wrapped in the novel, and it's really about these two former flames who suffered this personal tragedy. There's still a great deal of affection and love between them, but there's also a great deal of estrangement. And I just wanted to explore. When I was writing the novel, I just watched my wife go through a pregnancy, and we have a child who's thriving blessedly. But I was just intrigued by sort of the struggles of womanhood and motherhood, and intrigued to kind of write about that in some ways. And I felt like the character would read differently if it was a male character. We've seen a lot of kind of classic male private investigators. And so I sort of took that and ran with it. And I was curious about what the experiences were that she would have as a female actress in Los Angeles. Also, some of the backstory that's introduced in the novel. Her name is Allegra Tarot, and that's, of course, tarot like a deck of tarot cards. And in the novel, she had told her agent when she first arrived in Los Angeles as a new actress, she would tell her agent these stories about her mother, who's Sardinian and brings this whole heritage of tarot reading to her childhood. Allegra would tell her agent about this mother who had read tarot when she was a kid. And the agent loved that story and said, oh, you got to tell people that. It's going to stick in their mind, and you got to tell casting directors and producers. It helps make you interesting. And so Allegra Tarot was her stage name, or her screen name, rather. because her actual name was already taken by another member of the Screen Actors Guild. So that's sort of the backstory on how she ends up with this kind of quirky name.
So did you start off with the female character or the character in general, or did you have the story and put a character inside it?
The character sort of germinated first, and I was really fascinated by this idea of an actress, this kind of master actress who becomes a private investigator, and some of the plot details were elements that I had kind of kicked around some years before as a potential screenplay. At the time, I was thinking about maybe writing parts of the story as a screenplay. The industry was very much geared towards feature films that could be done for a number, that could be done for an affordable budget, particularly if you could write a thriller that was set in one or just a few locations. And so there was a version of the plot that I was kind of thinking about years ago that took place mostly within one house. But essentially what happens in the novel, without giving too much away, is Allegra, at the behest of her ex-husband, whose name is Dom, she goes looking for this bail skip, a young woman named Raleigh, and locates her pretty quickly in the novel. And that's really when the plot, I think, sort of catches fire, because Raleigh pulls her into a situation that Raleigh is contending with this mysterious stranger who's been menacing her. And there's a whole series of events, and the novel kind of quickly pivots into a murder mystery and a very fast-paced thriller. And so some of those plot mechanics were involved in this screenplay idea I had some years back, but it kind of wasn't entirely taking shape. And then years later, once I had this Allegra Tarot character and I was starting to kind of process this other young woman, Raleigh, who was the bail skip, the plot started to really take shape. It was very research intensive. I'm sure you hear that from a lot of writers. And the research part of the process to me is fascinating because it's valuable and very, very necessary. But I do find sometimes that the research is so engrossing, I can sort of get lost in that process, and it can become time consuming to a fault. And so I was reading up a lot about forensics investigations, and at one point I had decided that I needed a textbook, this homicide investigators textbook that they use in police academies. And so my birthday was coming up. My wife said, "What do you want for your birthday?" And I said, "I'd like this textbook." But it was really expensive because, it's a textbook. But she very gamely got this homicide investigators textbook for my birthday. And I remember opening it and then cracking the cover on the book. And it hadn't occurred to me, this textbook is about murder scenes, and it's full of really, really graphic full-color images. Now, these are not the kind of images you see in like an investigation discovery true crime special where they're sort of watered down because they're going to be on television. These were actual murder scene photos. And I was paging through this book, and it was really, really horrifying, this sort of gut punch. But I will say the book was invaluable. I would sort of have to cover my eyes as I was paging through it. But I ended up reading up a lot on crime scene investigation, which figures heavily into the story. And I also was researching a lot of other scenarios that feature in the novel, one of which is there's kind of a subplot that involves a willed body program, a program where people can will your body to science after you die, or you can bequeath the body of a loved one to science. And particularly there is, in certain undercurrents of that trade, there's the cadaver trade, the kind of black market in human body parts. And that subplot in the story was inspired somewhat by a real scandal we had in Los Angeles a long time ago, probably like 20 years ago, where there was a diener at UCLA Hospital, I believe. I'm probably not getting the details of this correct, but he was like stealing cadaver parts to sell on the black market. And I remember reading about this in the Los Angeles Times when it was occurring, and just thinking this was like the most kind of lurid, fascinating thing I'd ever heard. And so some of that kind of got folded in, and I ended up doing a lot of research on the cadaver trade and that whole black market, and spoke to a bunch of skip tracers. And so it's just kind of a fascinating exploration, I think.
So you really got into it, and you started trading body parts and everything.
Yes, exactly.
Sounds like a plot for a book.
So if you guys wake up tomorrow morning in a bathtub full of ice cubes with a note that says "Don't move until you call the paramedics," it was me who did it. I apologize.
So this story, did it come out with a subtext? Do you kind of have a meaning, or is this all entertainment?
I think so. It's largely entertainment. I mean, this is kind of a crime thriller, sort of murder mystery at its core. very character driven. I think very character forward, though. When I write fiction, I just really enjoy those kind of breakneck thrillers that really move, that have that sense of propulsiveness. And that's what I was going for here. Given my experience as a screenwriter, my experiences working in television, I know that the number one commandment as a writer that at least I feel like I have to adhere to is you have to capture and hold the interest of your reader. And so for me, it's all about giving you that kind of, I'm locked to my seat. I can't turn out the light and go to bed at the end of the night. I've got to keep turning the pages, so to speak. That to me, that sense of like kind of merciless suspense, when you get a novel that achieves that, it's really a special feeling, that feeling of being absolutely transfixed by a novel. One of my favorite crime novels is Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris, which of course, inspired an absolutely iconic film that's brilliant. But one of the things I love about the novel Silence of the Lambs is that I think it's the best procedural that at least I've ever read, and it just keeps you riveted on the kind of thrill of the hunt. There's also, I think, like many great crime stories, Silence of the Lambs has this almost mythic quality to it. It almost feels like you're reading a modern rendition of some folktale or some piece of mythology from hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and this is depicted really well in the film Silence of the Lambs, but you have this character, Clarice Starling, who's kind of untested. She's this apprentice. She's a trainee at the FBI Academy in the book and in the movie. And you follow her descent into this kind of symbolic underworld, which is represented by the mental hospital in Baltimore. And in the film, when you're watching the film, she's actually literally descending dark staircases and going through dungeness cage doors to get to the cell that holds the Minotaur figure, the monster at the center of the story, who's Hannibal Lecter. And of course, Hannibal's such a persuasive character because obviously he's a cannibal. He'll murder you and eat your flesh. And he's wily. He's this criminal genius. But more than all of that, the thing that Hannibal Lecter excels at is getting in your head. He gets to know you better than you know yourself, and he opens up your head and kind of starts rooting around in there and using your own nature against yourself. And so we're following Clarice as she goes on this almost Joseph Campbell-style journey into the dark core of the world to confront one monster, Hannibal Lecter, in order to vanquish another monster, Buffalo Bill. The other killer. And I just love that sort of mythic quality. And I think you see elements of that in Partial in Blood, where what starts out as this routine kind of justice system hunt for a bail skip who just has to make her court day leads to this kind of underworld of villains, and it forces our main character to confront her own personal grief. But so to return to the original premise of the question, what is kind of some of the ideas of the novel? It's primarily entertainment. It's primarily sort of a pulpy type story, but it's really playing with these notions of loss and notions of identity, the way that we are all many different facets of the same thing. There's a line in the novel where one character says to another, in life, we don't just represent one thing. We're a thing and its opposite. We have the capacity for loyalty, and we have the capacity for betrayal. We have the capacity for good and the capacity for evil. And that's really how I see human beings. I think humans are complex and often contradictory, and that really intrigues me. And I think you see that on display, hopefully, in the novel in all these different ways. We see it with Allegra, but then we see these other foils of other characters who are one thing, but then they're also its opposite. And I've always just sort of been intrigued by that. I'm also a huge true crime junkie, and I love reading true crime books. I love watching true crime documentaries. And one of the things that fascinates me about true crime stories, as you gentlemen can relate, there's always that moment on the episode of Dateline or in the true crime book where somebody says, oh, I never would have thought this person was capable of committing this murder. Or I never would have thought the Boy Scout troop leader was actually a serial murderer. And I'm always surprised when people say that, just because I feel like I sort of have an awareness of the complexity of human identity. And there's not a lot of people in the world who I would say definitively, oh, this person's not capable of that. They're not capable of that. They would never do this thing, or they'd never do that thing. I think one of the people whose actions I think I can probably predict is my spouse. And the other person is my son, who's only 7 years old. Other than that, I think most people are in many ways and under the right conditions kind of unpredictable. And so I was sort of interested in exploring that notion.
Well, you mentioned this in your answer. Let me hit it up. You fully defined or discussed the tarot character, Allegra Tarot. It's Hollywood, secondary characters. Tell me a little bit about the orbit around, the bad people or whoever it might be that show her character, bring out her character.
So there's another character that gets sort of involved in Allegra's search, and he is a retired LA County homicide detective, and his name is Frank Olson in the novel. And Olson is kind of our secondary lead, our other heavy behind Allegra Tarot. And I'm loath to say he's the antagonist. I see him as sort of the secondary lead of the novel. And, you know, when it comes to creating villains, I think in any good story, the villain should be as persuasive, as charismatic, as complex and nuanced, and in some ways relatable as your protagonist should be. And that was kind of what I aspired to with Frank. He's this guy who, and you hear about this a lot with homicide detectives, he's this guy who had this case that he could never solve, and he took it into retirement with him. And as he saw his life kind of moving towards its conclusion, he was aging, he had aged out by years from the job. All of the guys he knew were starting to retire as well. As he was moving towards the end of life, and as he was seeing his world shrink, that one case, the killer that had gotten away, just kept haunting him like a ghost. It kept sort of chewing at the edge of his thoughts. And so part of the plot involves this character, Frank, who's several years into retirement, kind of carrying on an unorthodox, unsanctioned investigation that comes to involve Allegra and the character of Raleigh. And just in creating that character, I was very cognizant of the fact that, like, he couldn't be one-dimensional. He needed to be a fully realized, fully fleshed out character. I think all of us are the hero in our own journey, and I think that's true of people who do bad deeds as well. They are the hero of their own story. They had a motivation for doing what they're doing, and certainly there are exceptions to this. You have truly insane, psychopathic people, but I think for most people, the rationale for their own actions makes sense to them, and I think we're all good at rationalizing our actions. You know, whenever we get into an argument with anybody, we see ourselves as being in the right, and the other person is being in the wrong. And so hopefully, like, the reader will have sort of an exploration of empathy in confronting this character. That's what I was experiencing when I was creating the character, of like, how do I make this guy as relatable as possible? In his world, he's doing the right thing. And so Frank Olson, the retired detective, or detective emeritus, as he refers to himself, is kind of the secondary lead of the story.
So what kind of relationship do you have with your characters? Like, do you hear them, see them? Can you picture who they are?
You know, it's interesting. I will sometimes, so what I do is I sort of conceive of a character, and then you kind of start to sketch them out and think about their backstory. I don't lock stuff down too soon, but then I'll just start doing free writing. I'll just get out that blank notebook. I've got a lot of notebooks sitting around the house, many of them full, but I love to just take a pen to paper and just get back to the most basic form of writing, which is pen and paper. And I start sketching out little vignettes involving that character to try and find their voice and let the character reveal themselves to me. And that can be kind of a fascinating process, because the character will very quickly start to express itself. And this is where the writing process starts to get a little woo-woo. This is where I think the breath of the muse starts kind of blowing into your ear, and the character starts to become this fully fleshed being, and they start to express themselves. Usually at this point, once I've kind of found the voice or the operating style of a character, I'll go back and start devising their backstory and write out a backstory. For Partial in Blood, I found a lot of use in mapping out the astrological signs of the various characters. You won't be surprised to know that Allegra, the main character, is a Taurus. Raleigh is a Pisces, which I myself am. And I was thinking about, you know, where is their moon sign? Where's their sun sign? What is their ascendant sign? This may be the Los Angeles resident in me, the kind of crunchy woo-woo guy myself. But so once you start to devise all those elements of backstory, the characters start to come to life, and you start to think about the actor who might play them in the movie. With the character of Frank Olson, I remember picturing like a middle-aged Brian Dennehy. Of course, he's no longer with us, but that's who would have played him like in his heyday. And the character starts to kind of come to life. And then you'll have these weird moments where like the characters are appearing in your dream and you're interacting with them or they're interacting with each other. And that could be kind of fascinating to watch that all come to life. But I think that's part of this strange sort of, there is kind of a supernatural quality to writing and to the creative act. I mean, there's a lot of stories, there's a lot of ideas that I think of that I never execute because they just don't feel like they chime with some inner part of my soul. Whereas the things you do write are the things that really speak to you. These characters come to life and they demand to be released and walk the earth. And so that's kind of how the process works for me. And then sometimes there are characters who, in the process of writing a story, somebody who you thought was going to be a very minor character starts to assert themselves in a much more proactive way. That sort of happened in Partial in Blood with the character of Allegra's former mother-in-law, whose name is Glynis. They call her Abuelita. And she was a character who sort of appeared in outline form. She appeared in a couple of scenes. And I just really enjoyed her voice, and I enjoyed watching her knock up against the other characters. And so she ended up becoming a much larger fixture of the finished novel. As I referenced, I'm a big outliner. I think particularly when you're writing like a thriller or a mystery story, to me, I can't really start something unless I know how it's going to end, because you need to be dropping all those seeds in the exact right part of the soil for them to kind of blossom correctly. So I'm a big outliner, but then what you discover is that there are these kind of epiphanies that happen along the way. You're making discoveries, happy discoveries and some problematic discoveries. And the story sometimes will diverge from the outline or go in a different direction. And that's kind of a rewarding process as well. And then there are times where you sort of write yourself into a corner and you need to stop down and go back and work your way out of that alley and figure it all out.
Wow, really interesting. Let's talk about how people find you. Are you out and available?
Yes.
So your website, social media.
You can find me at Blair Kroeber on TikTok. I'm also on Instagram. Not really on Twitter anymore. Twitter just became a bit of a Mos Eisley cantina of scum and villainy, and not really my operating speed. But hit me up on TikTok, and I TikTok about writing and storycraft and storytelling.
Well, fantastic. Now, we're going to have that up along with your book, so everyone can find it. And what more can I say? It's been a real pleasure. Enjoy talking to you.
It has been a pleasure for me as well, gentlemen. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a joy, and keep up the good work. The interviews are always very, very engrossing.
Well, thank you very much. So Blair Kroeber, Partial in Blood, audiobook now. Don't miss it.
Check it out anywhere audiobooks are sold.
This has been a production of the House of Mystery Radio Show. To find out more about our show, guests, or hosts, go to our website at houseofmysteryradio.com.